Action movies are built to look effortless, precision, stunts, explosive set pieces, and heroes who walk through chaos as if it were choreographed just for them. But beyond the polished final cut lies a world far less controlled, where tempers run hotter than fireballs, and entire productions wobble under the weight of the very stars meant to lead them. The audience sees adrenaline and triumph. The crew often sees tension, mistrust, and the quiet fear that one wrong move could unravel everything. Hollywood's glossy marketing machine paints a picture of harmony actors working hand in hand with directors' teams united under a shared vision. But behind the studio gates, many of the most celebrated action films were held together by little more than desperation. Some sets were battlegrounds powered by ego. Others were sinking ships where the stars' behavior refusals, rewrites, disappearances, power struggles pushed the production to the edge of collapse. Tonight, we're opening the door to those hidden rooms. These are the stories of movies nearly destroyed from within films, where scripts were torn apart hours before shooting, where stunt teams rebuilt entire sequences overnight, where directors lost control, and where the biggest obstacle wasn't the explosions, but the person standing in front of the camera. Some of these movies barely survived. Others only made it through because studios locked away the truth, hoping audiences would never learn how close everything came to falling apart. So take a deep breath and step inside, because the real drama wasn't on the screen. It was happening just out of frame behind doors the public was never supposed to open. Fact 1. Die Hard, 1988. Bruce Willis's doubts throw the set into disarray. When Die Hard began filming, Bruce Willis was far from the confident action icon he would later become. He stepped onto the set as an actor known mostly for light comedy, suddenly expected to transform into a hardened everyman hero. That uncertainty seeped into the production almost immediately. Willis questioned scene motivations, challenged tone, and pushed back on dialogue as if he were rewriting the character from scratch. The tension sharpened when it came to physical scenes. McClane was meant to be bruised, battered, and pushed to his limits, but Willis resisted several stunt-heavy moments, insisting they didn't align with his vision of the character or that they simply didn't feel right. Entire stunt setups, hours in preparation, were abruptly scrapped. The stunt team scrambled to devise replacements under relentless time pressure. Director John McTiernan found himself juggling two parallel productions, the one he'd planned and the one evolving out of Willis's hesitations. Scenes were constantly reshaped on the fly, sometimes mere minutes before cameras rolled. Studio executives watching early cuts voiced alarm over the inconsistency in tone and performance, fearing the film was unraveling before it even found its footing. Yet, through that storm of revisions and resistance, something unexpected emerged, a more grounded, reluctant hero whose fragility became iconic. But make no mistake, Die Hard survived not because the process was smooth, but because the production managed to stay afloat despite its own lead actor fighting the film at every turn. Fact 2. The Expendables 3, 2014. When Bruce Willis's ultimatum nearly crippled the franchise, the third chapter of The Expendables was intended to be a celebration of action legends, a gathering of familiar faces reuniting under Sylvester Stallone's vision. But behind the curtain, the film nearly collapsed before cameras even rolled. The spark came from Bruce Willis, whose sudden demand for an astonishing paycheck for only a handful of shooting days sent shockwaves through the production. His ultimatum wasn't a negotiation tactic, it was a threat. If his demands weren't met, he would walk. And because his character was integral to the developing script, his departure would leave a gaping hole. Stallone was blindsided. With schedules closing in and investors breathing down his neck, the production teetered on the edge of crisis. Writers locked themselves in rooms to devise emergency rewrites. Producers scrambled through phone calls at all hours searching for alternatives. Stallone himself, usually the unshakable anchor of the franchise, reached a breaking point. His frustration erupted publicly in a rare display of candor that revealed just how close the film had come to imploding. Harrison Ford was brought in at the last possible moment, stepping into a reworked role crafted with astonishing speed. His addition saved the film, but the scars of the upheaval remained. Crew members later said that the quiet panic of those days never truly dissipated. On screen, The Expendables 3 plays like a loud, polished ensemble blockbuster. Off-screen, it was a production held together by hurried rewrites and last-minute heroics, all triggered by a single star's refusal to compromise. Fact 3. Blade Trinity 2004. Wesley Snipes' withdrawal turns the film into a puzzle. Blade Trinity was poised to conclude the franchise with style until Wesley Snipes arrived on set bearing deep resentment and mistrust. Feeling sidelined in what he believed was his own series, Snipes retreated into isolation. He avoided cast and crew, declined direct communication with director David S. Goyer, and relied instead on curt, cryptic notes. Filming became an elaborate dance around a star who refused to engage. When Snipes did appear, his participation was unpredictable. He rejected blocking, rewrote dialogue without notice, and refused to shoot certain scenes altogether. Crew members recall hours lost waiting for him to emerge from his trailer, only to realize he wouldn't come out at all. The energy on set grew tense, brittle, overshadowed by his simmering frustration. Tensions escalated into confrontations, verbal, and at times, nearly physical. Producers whispered about shutting down the project, but contractual obligations and financial realities chained everyone to a rapidly deteriorating set. As Snipes pulled further away, editors were left assembling the film, using body doubles, alternate angles, and digital trickery to fill the gaps where the lead actor should have been. The final movie is a patchwork of compromises. It seems hidden only by the frantic creativity of those working behind the scenes. What was meant to be a triumphant finale instead stands as a testament to how a single withdrawal of effort from the very person meant to anchor the story can throw an entire production into jeopardy. Fact 4. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, 1985. Mel Gibson's emotional fallout shadows the set. By the time the third Mad Max film began shooting, Mel Gibson was no longer the unknown young actor who had stumbled into a cult classic role. He was a global figure grappling with immense personal strain. That private turmoil quietly bled into the production, creating an undercurrent of fragility that clashed against the film's harsh, post-apocalyptic exterior. Gibson frequently pushed back against the script, arguing that Max should be darker, more broken, stripped of any sentiment the page attempted to reintroduce. His objections came suddenly, sometimes moments before setup, forcing the directors George Miller and George Ogilvy to reconfigure entire sequences on instinct. Scenes that had been meticulously mapped out were reshaped on the spot to suit Gibson's fluctuating emotional landscape. Stunt teams already burdened by the dangerous desert environment found themselves racing to redesign action beats that Gibson rejected at the last minute. Crew members said some days felt like holding their breath, waiting to see what would set off the next chain of changes. Layered beneath Gibson's volatility was the emotional weight carried by George Miller, who was mourning the death of his longtime collaborator, Byron Kennedy. That grief permeated the set, magnifying every point of tension. With both creative pillars of the franchise wrestling their own internal storms, the production operated in a state of constant improvisation. Despite the strain, the film was completed, and its somber tone, its air of exhaustion, its sense of a world and a man stretched thin, echoed the reality behind the cameras more closely than anyone intended. Fact 5. Mission Impossible 2. 2000 Tom Cruise's pursuit of danger pushes everyone to the edge. With Mission Impossible 2, Tom Cruise approached the role of Ethan Hunt with a singular objective to redefine what an action star could physically achieve on screen. That objective quickly evolved into an obsession, reshaping the production around increasingly dangerous stunts that required precision reinvention and nerves of steel from every department involved. Cruise insisted on performing feats that most actors would never consider, from hanging off a cliff without a safety net to choreographing knife fights so realistic they pushed the boundaries of comfort. Each escalation meant additional planning, added stress, and expanded safety protocols. Stunt coordinators worked long hours refining choreography, only to start over again when Cruise pushed for something even more ambitious. Director John Woo found himself navigating an actor with unshakable resolve and a vision that kept expanding. Scenes originally built for simplicity ballooned into elaborate sequences, requiring new rigs, new angles, or new practical effects. Days were lost. Weeks vanished. And the ripple effect spread across Hollywood as other productions were forced to adjust, while MI2 consumed far more time than expected. Behind the scenes, admiration for Cruise's commitment blended with unease. Crew members spoke of holding tension in their shoulders during every high-stakes stunt. One wrong move could halt the film, or worse. The result was a movie dripping with spectacle powered by a star who poured everything he had into the physicality of the role. But beneath the stylish, slow-motion shots and operatic action, the crew remembered a production stretched taut by the demands of a performer determined to push his limits and theirs to the brink. Fact 6. Waterworld 1995. Kevin Costner's tight grip sends the film into turbulent waters. From its inception, Waterworld was an audacious gamble, a floating world built on massive structures, complex stunts, and unpredictable ocean conditions. But the true turbulence didn't come from the environment alone. Kevin Costner, at the height of his influence, exercised a level of creative control that steadily overwhelmed the production. Costner weighed in on nearly every phase of the film. He contested story arcs, reshaped dialogue, and pressed for revisions to major action sequences. These changes often required extensive reconfiguration of the already temperamental floating sets, leaving production teams scrambling to keep up. Storms damaged equipment. Construction teams rebuilt. Just as they stabilized, new creative demands from Costner would send them back into redesign mode. The tension between Costner and director Kevin Reynolds deepened as the shoot progressed. They clashed on tone pacing and character portrayal arguments that lasted hours and stalled entire departments. Crew members quietly aligned themselves with one side or the other, splitting the set into factions that rarely communicated smoothly. Morale eroded further when it became widely known that while the crew battled harsh conditions on the water, Costner retired each night to luxurious accommodations on land. Resentment simmered, and the divide between star and crew widened with every grueling day. By the time the final scenes were captured, friendships had ended. The budget had skyrocketed, and Waterworld had become a symbol of Hollywood excess. Yet beneath that reputation lies a deeper story how one actor's domineering creative force pushed a fragile production into relentless churning chaos. Fact 7. Speed 2, Cruise Control, 1997. Sandra Bullock's hesitation leaves the film without a pulse. When Speed 2 was announced, the studio believed that Sandra Bullock's star power would be enough to keep the sequel afloat without Keanu Reeves. But Bullock entered the project with visible reluctance. She disliked it. The script felt unexcited about returning to the genre and was wary of being boxed into the mold of an action heroine. Her reservations quickly cast a long shadow over the production. Bullock shied away from the more physical demands of the role, turning down many of the stunt-driven sequences that had been scripted for her character. As a result, entire set pieces had to be softened, rewritten, or removed entirely. Instead of an active protagonist driving the story forward, Annie became a more reactive presence, forcing the writers to restructure the film's emotional and action beats to compensate. Shooting on a massive cruise ship required precision and coordination. Yet Bullock's lack of enthusiasm created constant obstacles. Scenes meticulously planned around her involvement were repeatedly reconfigured to reduce her physical presence. The stunt and camera teams scrambled to redesign choreography and shot lists, while writers worked overtime rewriting character dynamics to mask the absence of the lead actress from crucial moments. Whispers spread through the crew that the film was drifting without direction, its energy evaporating scene by scene. Bullock remained professional, but her lack of passion was impossible to conceal from those who depended on her leadership to anchor the tone. In the end, the sequel's heart never beat as strongly as the originals, because the actress meant to carry it was never fully invested in the journey. Fact 8. Top Gun 1986. Tom Cruise's drive to perfect his image rewrites the skies. The legend of Top Gun has always revolved around Tom Cruise's magnetic screen presence, but the behind-the-scenes reality reveals a star meticulously crafting an image long before he became a global icon. Cruise approached Maverick not just as a character, but as a symbol, an embodiment of cool, fearless confidence. And he worked tirelessly to ensure the film reinforced that image in every frame. Cruise openly challenged lines that undermined Maverick's mystique. Emotional beats were trimmed if they suggested too much uncertainty. Scenes hinting at vulnerability were reshaped or redesigned. He pushed for a version of Maverick who was effortlessly dominant, a pilot whose flaws were overshadowed by charisma rather than defined by internal struggle. The aerial sequences became the battleground for these adjustments. Cruise pushed for more cockpit time, insisting on shots that highlighted Maverick's control rather than his fear. He lobbied for additional angles, new maneuvers, and expanded hero moments that required significant coordination with pilots and camera teams. Safety protocols were rewritten, equipment reconfigured, and schedules disrupted as his requests multiplied. His influence extended into the film's romantic and interpersonal arcs as well. Cruise favored a cooler, more stylized approach, curating Maverick's interactions to align with the composed, iconic persona he envisioned. The film that emerged was undeniably electric, in part because Cruise shaped it so deliberately. But behind the scenes, his determination to perfect his on-screen identity forced the production into countless pivots, each one a reminder that when a star's image is on the line, nothing is safe from revision. Fact 9. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1996. Val Kilmer's turmoil turns the set into a meltdown zone. Few films in modern Hollywood history descended into chaos as dramatically as The Island of Dr. Moreau. At the center of the disaster was Val Kilmer, whose off-screen turbulence overwhelmed an already fragile production. Fresh from the notoriously difficult Batman Forever, Kilmer arrived with an energy that was volatile, distant, and often combative. He repeatedly showed up late, dismissed creative direction, and resisted performing scenes he found uninteresting. Lines were changed without warning. Blocking was ignored. Kilmer's temperament shifted unpredictably, leaving cast and crew uncertain whether any given day would be merely tense or completely unworkable. Director Richard Stanley, whose visionary approach had earned him the project, found himself sidelined and demoralized as Kilmer challenged his authority scene after scene. The friction escalated until the studio removed Stanley entirely. His departure devastated the crew, many of whom had signed on specifically to work under his direction. When John Frankenheimer stepped in, the atmosphere grew no calmer. Kilmer clashed with the new director as well, continuing to disrupt production with refusals, sudden mood swings, and open antagonism. Cast members avoided him. Extras in heavy creature suits spoke of barely contained dread on days when he appeared particularly irritable. Entire sequences were shot around Kilmer's absence or indifference, using doubles or tight angles to disguise his lack of cooperation. The film slowly became a patchwork of compromises, stitched together from whatever usable footage the crew could salvage. The final product was a surreal tangle of ideas and tones. But the chaos behind it told a clearer story, a production pushed to the brink by a star, whose inner turmoil spilled into every corner of the set, shaping the film far more than any script or director ever could. Fact 10. Tango and Cash, 1989. Stallone's overreach pulls the film in two directions. Tango and Cash was initially conceived as a sharp, fast-moving buddy action thriller built on the friction between Sylvester Stallone's disciplined persona and Kurt Russell's loose improvisational energy. But once filming was underway, the tone of the entire project shifted because Stallone became increasingly determined to mold the film into something that reflected his own cinematic sensibilities. He challenged dialogue, constantly asking for lines to be reworked so Ray Tango would appear cleverer, more composed, more commanding. Writers were summoned multiple times a day for on-the-spot revisions. Scenes scheduled and prepped for hours were suddenly rebuilt because Stallone wanted a different rhythm, a different joke, or a different interpretation. What began as a collaboration slowly morphed into a production orbiting around Stallone's vision. Director Andrei Konchalovsky found himself caught between the film he had planned and the film Stallone seemed to be commandeering. Their creative disagreements intensified, each pulling the movie in opposing tonal directions, one leaning gritty, the other leaning stylized and glossy. The tension grew so disruptive that Konchalovsky was eventually dismissed, leaving the project in the hands of Albert Magnoli, who had to stitch together a narrative from an increasingly incoherent shoot. Kurt Russell did his best to adapt, but even he struggled to maintain consistency as the ground shifted beneath him daily. Crew members described the experience as working on a movie that reinvented itself every morning, never settling long enough for anyone to catch their breath. On screen, Tango and Cash became a quirky cult favorite. But behind it lay the story of a production torn between two visions. One planned the other, imposed, held together only by the sheer force of will of the people, trying not to let it fall apart. Fact 11. The Bourne Identity 2002. Matt Damon's fight for authenticity rebuilds the film from the inside. When Matt Damon signed on to play Jason Bourne, he envisioned a very different kind of action hero, raw-wounded, believable. But that vision clashed headfirst with Universal's expectation of a slick, high-energy spy movie. From the earliest days of production, Damon pushed for a grounded approach, challenging anything he felt betrayed the emotional truth of the character. He rejected lines that felt too polished or too heroic. He questioned choreography that made Bourne look superhuman rather than desperate. Scenes designed for spectacle were reworked to prioritize character. Writers restructured major set pieces to reflect Damon's insistence on a more psychological narrative, a reluctant assassin trying to piece together a shattered identity. Director Doug Liman supported Damon's instincts, which added another layer of friction with the studio. Universal became increasingly anxious as action scenes were delayed, rewritten, or replaced. Fight choreography had to be re-engineered to match Damon's desire for realism. Chase sequences were pared down, then rebuilt. The shoot spiraled weeks behind schedule. Reshoots became a lifeline. Damon continued to refine Bourne's tone, even in post-production, pushing for additional scenes that deepened the character's inner conflict. Editors found themselves piecing together two competing visions, the studio's action-first mandate and Damon's character-driven approach. The turmoil eventually birthed something groundbreaking, the gritty kinetic action style that redefined modern spy thrillers. But its creation was far from smooth. It was a film reborn through conflict, reshaped by an actor determined to create a hero, grounded not in spectacle, but in humanity. Fact 12. Kektek, 2002. Vin Diesel's dominance rewrites the film's identity. From the moment Kektek began filming, Vin Diesel made it clear that Xander Cage would not be just another action hero. He would be the action hero of the early 2000s. Diesel brought a powerful sense of ownership to the character, pushing to amplify Xander's toughness, confidence, and untouchable swagger. That dominance, however, came with a cost. Diesel frequently challenged dialogue that suggested uncertainty or emotional depth. Scenes intended to humanize Xander were rewritten to maintain an aura of invincibility. Writers found themselves revising arcs to ensure the character never appeared weak, conflicted, or overshadowed. The script slowly morphed into a vehicle showcasing Diesel's alpha persona rather than a balanced ensemble narrative. Action scenes expanded in scale as Diesel insisted on more impressive displays of physicality. Bigger jumps, louder explosions, more elaborate stunts. This led to constant recalibration from stunt teams and camera crews who were forced to redesign sequences on compressed timelines. Safety rigs had to be rebuilt. Entire days were consumed by trying to match Diesel's evolving vision. Even supporting characters were reimagined to ensure Xander remained the unquestioned focal point. Potential rivalries or emotional counterweights were softened or eliminated. Editors later admitted that they had to restructure major sections of the film. To maintain the tone, Diesel wanted trimming anything that made Xander appear anything less than dominant. The final movie became a high-octane spectacle with a clear identity, but it was a film shaped as much by ego as by creativity. Beneath its loud, stylish exterior lies a production bent around the gravitational pull of its star, a film that evolved not through collaboration, but through the force of one man's self-image. Fact 13. Predator 1987. Van Damme's discontent turns the creature into a crisis. In the earliest stage of Predator Jean-Claude, Van Damme was hired not as an action star, but as a performer buried inside a creature's suit and idea that immediately clashed with his ambitions. Expecting the role to showcase his martial arts mastery, Van Damme was stunned to learn he'd be hidden beneath layers of latex in a design he found awkward, uncomfortable, and creatively suffocating. Filming deep in the Mexican jungle only heightened his frustrations. The heat inside the suit was unbearable. Visibility was nearly non-existent, and movement was stiff and unnatural. Van Damme pushed back, demanding a sleeker, more agile creature, one that mirrored his signature fighting style, rather than the monstrous alien the filmmakers intended. His requests were repeatedly denied, creating a widening rift between him and the effects team. Tension escalated quickly. Van Damme refused multiple takes, left the set without warning, and openly clashed with crew members tasked with wrangling the unwieldy costume. Actors remember him fuming between setups, convinced the film was sabotaging his career instead of elevating it. Hours were wasted reworking shots he rejected on the spot. The breaking point came when he discovered he would never appear on screen as himself, not even briefly. The realization fueled a final confrontation that made his departure inevitable. Once he was dismissed, the production halted to redesign the Predator from the ground up. Only then did Stan Winston's now legendary version emerge, a towering, terrifying creature, nothing like the smaller insectoid Van Damme suit. On screen, the film is remembered as a landmark of creature cinema. But behind the scenes, the Predator's birth was delayed by a different kind of monster, a spiraling conflict between star expectations and studio reality. Fact 14. Lethal Weapon 4, 1998. Gibson's volatility puts pressure on every frame. By the fourth Lethal Weapon installment, Mel Gibson's portrayal of Martin Riggs had become iconic, chaotic, funny, and deeply human. But behind the scenes, Gibson's personal life was becoming increasingly turbulent, and those inner battles followed him directly onto the set. Crew members remember days where Gibson arrived, distracted pacing or visibly burdened. Other days, he radiated manic energy, improvising wildly or discarding dialogue moments before shooting. Scenes rehearsed carefully in the morning were transformed by afternoon, because Gibson felt the tone needed to shift. Dialogue rewrites became a near constant demand. These unpredictable swings bled into the action too. Certain stunts that had been meticulously planned were suddenly rejected, forcing the stunt team to scramble for alternatives. With Jet Li joining the cast, bringing a level of precision unfamiliar to Hollywood, at the time the contrast between Gibson's spontaneous style and Li's discipline created an added layer of tension. Director Richard Donner, seasoned from years of guiding the franchise, worked overtime to maintain stability. But even he struggled to keep the film cohesive when the heart of its narrative was being rewritten by the impulses of its lead actor. Crew members described the atmosphere as one of collective caution, everyone waiting to see which version of Gibson would walk on a set that day. When audiences watched Lethal Weapon 4, they saw camaraderie, humor, and action. What remained hidden was the tightrope the production walked to mask the unpredictable force behind its central character, an instability that nearly derailed the film from within. Fact 15. The Avengers, 1998. Ralph Fiennes' disengagement leaves a void no filmmaker could fill. Before superheroes dominated Hollywood, there was another attempt at a stylish spy action spectacle, The Avengers, 1998. With Ralph Fiennes and Uma Thurman attached, the studio imagined a charming, quirky revival of the British classic. But from the moment filming began, it was clear that Fiennes had little interest in the project, and his indifference became an obstacle that no amount of directing could overcome. During table reads, Fiennes reportedly dismissed lines with a flat monotone, signaling a lack of investment that never improved. On set, he often delivered takes with minimal energy, ignoring cues or declining to adjust his performance despite repeated direction. Scenes that relied on chemistry fell apart when Fiennes offered nothing for Thurman to respond to, leaving emotional beats hollow, comedic timing dead on arrival. His detachment infected the tone of the entire film. Crew members described the experience as watching someone perform out of obligation rather than passion. The already fragile production, strained by rewrites and studio micromanagement, buckled further under his lack of engagement. Directors tried to coax more warmth, more charisma, more commitment. None came. At times, Fiennes seemed visibly irritated to be there at all. Editors later struggled to piece together sequences where his energy matched Thurman's, or the film's intended style. The result was an uneven, drifting narrative that no amount of post-production work could revive. When the film was released, critics and audiences were baffled by its lifeless tone. But those who lived through the shoot knew exactly why. No production, no matter how ambitious, can thrive when its leading man refuses to step fully into the role. Bonus fact, The Crow, 1994. A catastrophe forged by fatigue, oversight, and the illusion of safety. The Crow was supposed to be Brandon Lee's defining moment. A film that would finally lift him from the long shadow cast by his father's legacy and establish him as a singular force in Hollywood. Instead, it became one of the most haunting tragedies the industry has ever tried to contain. What happened on that set wasn't destiny, wasn't bad luck. It was the result of an exhausted crew, an overloaded schedule, and a chain of overlooked warnings that spiraled into catastrophe. From early in production, cracks began to show. The crew endured punishing night shoots, bitter cold, and relentless pressure to move quickly. Corners were trimmed wherever possible, not out of malice, but out of mounting fatigue. Safety meetings vanished. Weapons protocols loosened. Departments were stretched thin, juggling responsibilities that should have been handled with far more oversight. The prop gun that would end Brandon's life had already raised concerns. Dummy rounds had been prepared improperly. A fragment lingered inside the barrel, a fact lost as the weapon passed between hands in the rush of a chaotic schedule. When the night arrived for the pivotal scene, the required checks weren't performed with the diligence they needed. People were tired, confident in the illusion that nothing could go wrong. That illusion cost a life. The moment the gun fired, the room froze. For a breathless span of seconds, many believed Brandon's staggering fall was part of the performance. Then panic erupted, screams, scrambling medics, a desperate attempt to reverse the irreversible. Brandon was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was already beyond saving. Hours later, the world lost a rising star at just 28. Hollywood acted fast. Investigations were narrowed. Statements were softened. responsibility blurred until it dissolved into a narrative of accident and unforeseeable tragedy. Those who had worked alongside Brandon knew this wasn't the truth. It wasn't fate, it was failure. Systemic, preventable failure. The film was ultimately completed, stitched together with the scenes Brandon had already filmed, preserving a performance both magnetic and heartbreaking. But beneath its gothic beauty lies a deeper truth. The Crow stands not only as Brandon Lee's final work, but as a reminder of what can happen when exhaustion, haste, and complacency take root behind the camera. The stories hidden behind these productions remind us that what shines brightest on screen often casts the darkest shadows behind it. Hollywood will always show you the spectacle, the triumph, the heroism, the illusion of perfect control. But behind that carefully crafted image lies a world shaped by ego, tension, exhaustion, and the kinds of secrets no studio ever intends to reveal. If these glimpses into the unseen truth made you look at familiar films differently, then remember there are countless more stories waiting behind the curtain. Some whispered, some buried, all of them shaping the movies we think we know. Stay close, because every time we pull the velvet curtain back, Hollywood becomes a little less glamorous and a lot more real.